Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basic. Welcome to the second half of my interview with Dr. John Johnson about the Chumash Uprising of 1824. In this second half, we get deeper into the effects and the implications of the uprising on later California history. I hope you enjoy it. What would you say is was the legacy of this uprising? 10 years later, the missions are secularized, and then 20 years later, thereabouts, the United States annexes the territory. California becomes a state. Have you been able to discern any particular legacies from this uprising?
Well, I think it's very interesting. There's been about this same time, I've been working on another project, which is the Indians of Mission San Buenaventura, just 2 years after the uprising, are taking a very different approach. They are actually petitioning the new Mexican governor of California for their emancipation in a formal petition. And so I think the Indians at the missions, by the time 1820s come along, we have California now be part of Mexico instead of part of the Spanish Empire. They're ready for their independence. They feel like they're just as much a citizen as the soldiers and their families, the Spanish Californians, or the Californios. And so they there's all this agitation, for the Indians to become independent from the missions. And so San Buenaventura, they took a very different approach where they petitioned the Echeandía, who had taken over as governor of California, Mexican governor of California in, 1825. And by 1826, he's issued an emancipation decree whereby Indians could apply for their independence from the missions. And so the Indians of San Buenaventura, at least half that Indian population applies for release. And it's opposed by the missionary who was stationed there at the time. He says the whole mission will collapse if you grant all these people their independence. And so, it didn't end up happening quite that way, but within a few years, there was, many of them did gain their release from the mission. And so I've been working with that. I have a very interesting series of documents. There's been some description of this in the historical literature, but I've been digging deeper into that whole event too, and identifying who the Indians were and so on. And why did some petition and some not petition? There are factions within these Indian mission communities too. Not everyone is of the same mind, right? And so what are the reasons why some petition and some don't? And, that's also is something I've been looking into. But what was your original question? Let's go back to that.
Well, the question
Did I answer? I'm not sure I answered it.
I think the question was exactly that. How did the uprising then determine or affect the rest of the period? How did it affect things going forward after the uprising?
Well, I think some of the Indians, like at Ventura, looked to another approach, and then things were moving along with regard to the Mexican government, the new governor Echeandía. He's there to kind of, I think, start a pathway for the Indians to become just independent citizens of Mexico. And it didn't actually fully happen until the 1830s. One of his successors, which was Governor Figueroa, who actually implemented the full secularization of the missions. But Echindia was moving forward, and a number of Indians did petition and gain their release in the 1820s, during that period, as near as we can tell. And unfortunately, a lot of the documents for the Mexican period are not as good as for the Spanish period. We don't have as many surviving documents that we can look to inform us about what's going on. Some people think there were many Indians who never returned to the mission after the uprising, that remained. For example, the Indians from Santa Barbara remained in the southern San Joaquin Valley. And in general, I don't find that there were large numbers that remained away. I think almost everybody can be accounted for in the burial records. But there's some that you can't account for, and there could be some who did never return. I know at Santa Ynez, there's one family in particular, which they write in the Padrón. The Padrón is like a census book of the Indians living at the mission, and the missionary writes in the Padrón, that they fled, they remain, they have fled, to the, and had, were hiding out, keeping independent from the mission. So one particular family, he writes this. But in general, most everyone you can account for, even members of that family returned to that mission. You can count for them in the burial records.
Well, that was exactly what I was going to ask, was were there people who stayed away from the mission after the uprising and didn't return? So that's interesting in itself. What do you think that says? Because clearly the relationship at this time, 1824, thereabouts, between the Indians and the Mexican government, the missionaries, the military, is, for lack of a better word, complex. What do you think it says about their relationship, the fact that most of them return to the mission, or the mission lands, let's say?
Yeah, well, if you stop and think about it, it was their home, it was their homeland, their territory. They had been born in villages near those missions, like Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, and so on. They had lived under the mission system for several decades, and they now the Indians from Santa Barbara had removed themselves to the southern San Joaquin Valley, where they were in the midst of a region that was not their tribal territory, where people spoke completely unrelated languages, the Yokuts people of the southern San Joaquin Valley. And they at the mission for several decades, they've been living under an agricultural subsistence base, where they were relying upon the beef and the sheep and so on, the meat that the mission was raising, as well as the agricultural fields. If they would have stayed in the southern San Joaquin Valley, they would have been returning to a hunting-gathering way of life. So by the time you get to 1824, it's not so easy to go back to a way of life that would have been practiced, a half century earlier.
In a place that's not your home.
And really, they in the place that's not your homeland. Yes. So I think that's one of the ways that one of the reasons why eventually the uprising was resolved. It was resolved exactly 200 years ago in June of 1824, when the president of the missions came down to Santa Barbara. He convinced the missionary at Santa Barbara to come with him. A troop of soldiers accompanied them. We have a diary of that account. And they go into the southern San Joaquin Valley to San Emilio, to the Rancho San Emilio. It was this Rancho San Emilio was really just a small outpost. It wasn't much at the time. And then they negotiated with the Indians that were on the island at Buena Vista Lake, and said, well, if you come over and come back, we'll be all given amnesty. There'll be no prosecutions of people for their role in the uprising. And then there was about the time of a religious celebration, and they said, we can hold that celebration here, but we need the choir. And so the Indian who had been very active in the revolt, one of the Indians, Jaime was also the choir master. So Jaime gets some of the others. They come over, they have the mass, that they all participated in, and everything is eventually resolved. And the Indians then returned back through the mountains to Santa Barbara. And the majority, and some came in. They said, the missionary wrote that some continued to come in the weeks afterwards, working their way back to the mission.
Were the missions in the Santa Barbara area different from some of the more northern missions, for example, where there was more of a mixture of different communities, different language groups? For example, up in Santa Clara, I know there was a mixture of Ohlone people and Yokuts from the other side, from the Central Valley, who came over. It seems maybe like in the Santa Barbara region, it was a little bit more of a homogenous community. Does that make sense, or am I on the right track?
Yeah, I think all missions had more than one language being spoken at them. We do have some Yokuts Indians at Santa Barbara, San Ynez, and La Purísima, but actually not until later in the 1830s we get more of the Yokuts coming in from the southern San Joaquin Valley to join those missions. At the time you're talking about 1824, you're right. It was more homogeneity at the missions in the Chumash region compared to the missions you're referring to at San Jose or Santa Clara or San Juan Bautista, for example, even Santa Cruz. All of those missions had San Antonio. They had big contingents of Yokuts Indians, and Santa Barbara not so much. However, if you read those accounts, the Spanish accounts of the Chumash Uprising, the accounts that are in Spanish, the Indians, the leaders at both Santa Barbara and La Purísima, are said to have been sending offerings of beads and so on to the Indians in the southern San Joaquin Valley to get them to join with them to fight the soldiers. That was going on. But in the north, you see factions developing. I think there's been a study done by Tish and James Sandos of the Indians at San Jose, about the factions between the older Indians, who are the Ohlone people, with the more recent arrivals, the Yokuts, and how factions develop between those two groups within that mission community that led to another uprising there up at San Jose, the revolt of Stanislaus, it's called. And, but that was a few years after the Chumash Uprising down in the south. You don't quite see that same thing happening, but you do see that the Indians from the Channel Islands, who spoke a very different language from those on the mainland coast, you do see them kind of living apart. And the islanders are more recent arrivals at the missions, San Buenaventura, Santa Barbara, San Ynez, La Purísima. The islanders who came to those missions were more recent arrivals and were not really integrated fully with the others, and for the most part did not seem to participate in the uprising. It was the older group that were the ones who were participating in the uprising. In fact, the islanders at Santa Barbara, we know that a bunch of them just got in their plank canoes, their tomalos, and went out back to Santa Cruz Island, just waited out the events until they then finally returned to the mission.
Do you think that the uprising in the Santa Barbara region had much influence on these later uprisings, like Stanislaus or Pomponio, for example, or others?
Well, I think I'm trying to remember when Pomponio, what year that was. He was in San Francisco Peninsula, I think. I think that was that earlier, Pomponio?
I'm going to have to double check. I seem to recall
I don't remember the exact
1829 thereabouts. I'm not sure, but I can look it up while you're talking.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I think it very likely could have had an influence on those events, especially if Pomponio was later. I didn't remember what year Pomponio's escapades were.
No, you're right. He was prior. It says around 1818 through 18. He was captured and executed in February 6, 1824. So right around the time of the Chumash Uprising.
Yeah, I did not realize it was that close in time. That's interesting. Yeah, it would just be a day or two after the uprising down south.
How do Chumash people today talk about the uprising? Is it conserved, spoken of? I mean, I'm sure it's spoken of. Are there oral traditions to this day that are maintained regarding those events?
Well, a good question. One of my good friends, my good Chumash friends, Ernestine de Soto, is now in her mid-80s. Ernestine remembers her mother telling her stories about a particular individual who we know was one of the prominent leaders in the uprising at Mission Santa Barbara. So there is some oral tradition that's made its way. I've been told by a young fellow who says that there's stories that are passed down, but he wouldn't share them with me. So I don't know to what extent that these are someone's stories or imaginings. Actually, the particular people he apparently learned these stories from, I'm not sure are really close to a authentic Chumash past. So I don't know, to what extent those stories are, and I don't know those stories because he hasn't shared them with me. But I think a lot of what is the people today know, the Chumash descendants today, are coming from John Harrington's work with their ancestors. So I know at Santa Ynez, the Santa Ynez tribe, that they hired a linguist to translate some of the stories that were recorded in their ancestors' native language, in Maria Solaris's native languages, as written down by Harrington. They hired a linguist to translate those, so they know those stories from from what their ancestors shared with Harrington. That's how they preserve those stories. Now, if we were to go back another 60 years or so, there might have been elders who had passed down stories. Those people, of course, are no longer with us. But I would have liked to have interviewed them.
I was honored to hear your talk at Mission Santa Ynez. Do you plan to publish your talk somewhere, or do you publish your research?
Yes, I do plan to write it up. I've been working on it, actually. As I've said, I'm trying to figure out if I can identify the last little piece of information before I write it up is if I can identify the individuals who are said to have been killed during the fighting at Mission La Purísima. And so I put a fair amount of time into that particular investigation. And what I'm using are the two Padrón records for Santa Ynez and La Purísima, because a Padrón is a census book that the missionaries kept to kind of keep track of the people living at their mission. And in Santa Ynez and La Purísima, both of those books, the Padrón, they end them at the time of the uprising. The uprising takes place, and then within a year or two, they start a new Padrón. So we know exactly who's alive in 1824 when the Padron took place. I mean, you can go through and because of databases, both my own database and also the database that Huntington Library used to manage called the Early California Population Project, both of those databases, you can determine, exactly who was alive by looking at the Padron and who was alive at the time the uprising took place. And then because both missions, La Purísima and San Inés, started a second Padron just within a year or two, you can then see who's missing, who was alive, and then if they're missing in that second Padron, then those are the candidates for people who may have been killed and might be among those 16 casualties that were said to have died at Mission La Purísima. So I'm trying to try to do that one last little bit of research, and then I want to write up what I know.
I'm really looking forward to being able to read that when it comes out. And this, what you talked about today, and also at your talk at Santa Ynez, is so interesting because it provides different layers, different perspectives, like you said, the sort of the Rashomon effect regarding this big formative event in Alta California history, in California history. And I think it goes, this whole idea of going into the different versions, the different perspectives on the event, and also speaking about individuals and individual families, it provides something that oftentimes, at least I've seen when we talk about this time period in California, provides context, provides nuance, and it also allows us to see the people involved as human beings like ourselves, right, and not simply actors in a perfectly coherent narrative. So that makes me really excited to learn more, and I think it also helps us to think better about history and about the people who were the protagonists of that history here in California. So I appreciate that. Do you have, I know you're ensconced in this project right now, but I think you mentioned that you have some other things that when you finish up with this, that you'll be working on. Is there any big project or interesting project that you'll be working on after you wrap this up?
Oh, I have several projects, about too many probably. I'm, as I mentioned, I'm studying a document about the emancipation petition of the Indians of San Buenaventura. I also have an account that I would like to edit and publish. That's a missionary account from earlier in the mission period about what life was like at the mission, and it's been translated, but I want to add my annotations to it because I can, again, just as I did with the Chumash Uprising, I can identify the people he refers to in his account. He mentions specific Indians, and I can identify who they are and give a little bit of about their background to kind of flesh it out. And so that's another project. And there's too many others. I have also archaeological work, like our work at Santa Rosa Island at Arlington Springs, that I would like to finish writing up too. That's a major one. We've done quite a bit of research on that, and I feel under obligation to bring that out. That's the earliest evidence we have, or some of the earliest evidence we have for people in our region, 13,000 years ago. As you said at the beginning, there's two colonial periods: this very early colonization of the Americas, at the end of the Pleistocene, and then, the Spanish-Mexican colonial period.
Well, right. Yeah. And we spent a lot of time talking about the Spanish-Mexican period, and rightly so. But I hope that if you're kind enough in the future, I can invite you back to talk maybe about that earlier colonial period or anything else you'd like to talk about, because I think it's for fascinating for me, but I think for everybody listening, that would be great if you're willing.
I'd be happy to do it. You can tell I'm not shy about talking about these things.
And thank goodness you're not. There's still so much great work being done about California and California history, especially these early periods. And you work on the very, very beginnings and the later beginnings. So my goal is just to share the things that I'm getting exposed to with other people, because I think why not? If I'm learning something that fascinates me, I'm assuming that there are lots of at least some other people out there who find it fascinating as well. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.